Alan's hunt throughout the rest of the day was unsuccessful. There was nothing in sight. The hunting grounds that the pack uses frequently for food sources has obviously become common knowledge around the local area. The reflection of nothing to hunt within the grounds was a clear indication. What was Alan to do? As the day passed into evening, Alan decided that he would return to the pack habitat and explain his situation. He did attempt to find food using only the hunting ground area, but found nothing. Upon nearing the habitat, Alan eyed a singular, unexpected presence standing alone around the perimeter. There stood Torvo, leering at Alan. Alan became agitated at the sight of Torvo glaring at him. He could not utter a single word to say and decided to continue walking, looking straight ahead while ignoring Torvo altogether. As Alan neared Torvo's position, Torvo took one threatening step in front of Alan and tensed his body into a fighting stance. Alan stopped immediately and looked right at Torvo's face. "What?" Alan asked, hissing and annoyed. "You are no longer a part of the pack," stated Torvo harshly with a commanding and threatening voice. Alan's eyes instantly widened and his heart began to sink. The surrounding air became stiff and heavy, far heavier than the atmosphere that Cord made this morning. Neither Alan nor Torvo moved. Alan's mind was completely blank for a moment, and his body seemed to be frozen in place. Little by little, Alan began to piece together the situation. The more Alan thought, the more conclusive everything became. The task of using the hunting grounds only was a setup. Cord knew that the hunting grounds had been barren for some time. After Alan left the pack habitat, Torvo must have been summoned and tasked with delivering Cord's decree. If Alan failed to procure food, then he is sentenced to exile from the pack. Cord also specifically chose Torvo for issuing Alan's sentence. The reason was simple. Torvo was Alan's brother. Having your own brother exile you from the pack was an effective method to get the point across. Everything was perfectly calculated and formulated. Torvo kept his threatening stance and posture. His body was tense and stiff, waiting for Alan to move. However, Alan did nothing but stand in front of him motionless. Torvo's face became disgruntled. "You are to leave and never return," Torvo said swiftly to break the silence. With the final crushing statement, Alan sharply closed his eyes. His body began to quiver and shake subtly. Torvo, his one and only brother, was exiling him from the pack. A pack that once belonged to his family. Thoughts rushed into Alan's mind at a rapid pace. The overwhelming sensation of despair now gripped tightly around his heart. However, he knew he could not just stand here forever. With as much courage as he could muster, Alan very weakly said, "Take care of yourself, Torvo." Alan just turned and started walking back out towards the hunting grounds from where he came. Torvo stood there, watching his only brother walk away from their home. He slowly eased and relaxed his posture. However, his face was still tense, as if to show displeasure. With each passing moment, Torvo's expression darkened. With Alan now further away, Torvo turned and began to walk back towards the pack habitat with a sinister, brooding expression. Now alone, upset, and scared, Alan walked around the hunting grounds in a daze. Somehow, he returned to the tree where he met the pterosaur earlier. The ground was still littered with the strange round objects. Alan came to a stop and simply stared at the ground in a haze. After a brief moment, a huge buildup of thoughts rushed into his mind. The biggest thought that plagued him the most was what he was going to do from now on. Alan no longer had a home, a pack, or a destination to travel towards. He never anticipated that Cord would exile him from the pack. Throughout his life, Alan contently believed that he would remain in the pack no matter the circumstances. He thought of the pack as family. He may not have gotten along with Cord or Torvo very well, but he at least respected their choices and decisions. As for the rest of the pack, Alan could not think of anything that he would have done to offend them. Moreover, since no one has ever been exiled before, Alan assumed that any grievances would eventually be forgiven. But now that Alan has been exiled from the pack, he is now seeing things differently. The reality of the situation is pushing a revelation onto him. Maybe he was simply naive about the pack being family all along. Alan shifted his head from looking at the ground to the night sky. He kept his gaze on the starry night, thinking deeply and reflecting. Suddenly, distant flapping of wings and a black silhouetted shape came into view from the sky that seemed to be familiar. Alan watched as the shape descended onto the tree he was beneath. The red pterosaur from earlier today once again appeared. "You came back," Alan said weakly while cracking a soft smile across his face. The pterosaur chirped a few times and flapped their wings in response. She seemed to nonchalantly ignore Alan's overall somber mood. Alan did not seem to mind the fact that the pterosaur was ignorant of his sadness. Instead, he was actually rather happy that he had company. After a few moments, Alan reformed his face back to a sorrowful expression while looking up to the sky once more. The two of them sat in silence, embracing the evening together. "I am on my own from this point forward. I was just exiled from my pack," Alan said, breaking the silence. "I have no idea where to go, nor what I'm going to do. Throughout my entire life, I never thought I would lose my home. This feeling is unnerving. Maybe I could go back and try to convince the pack to let me rejoin. However, something tells me that I will likely be repudiated or worse." Alan was speaking aloud as if to convey his thoughts verbally. At this point, he did not really care if the pterosaur was listening or not. Alan was simply too depressed. Hearing himself say that he was exiled was enough to make him absent-minded about his surroundings. Alan and the pterosaur slipped into another moment of silence. The ongoing nighttime atmosphere was gentle and relaxing. The midday heat was cooling off, and the tranquil sounds of insects chiming filled the area. Eventually, the pterosaur chirped, breaking the silence again. She squeaked and chirped to get Alan's attention. Alan looked up at her, to see that she was protruding her head towards a particular direction. The midday experience from earlier was telling Alan to look towards the pterosaur's direction. As soon as he did, she chirped several more times. "What? Is something over there?" Alan asked. As Alan continued to look in the direction of where the pterosaur was pointing, he saw nothing. The open fields and plains showed no signs of movement, nor anything in particular. Alan continued scanning, but then the pterosaur screeched at him once more. Alan was beyond confused at this point and looked back up at her. "I do not understand. What are you trying to get me to?" Before Alan could finish, the pterosaur screeched at his face loudly. This sound was ear-piercing and enough to make Alan wince. Then, the pterosaur leapt off the tree and swiftly flew right next to Alan, almost touching him. She glided across the ground in the direction she was pointing. Startled by the pterosaur's reaction, Alan tried to stop her. He was completely bewildered. However, before he knew what was happening, the two of them were moving in the same direction together.